Words are strange and wonderful things, aren't they? One word can have more than one meaning. For example, take the word decent. It can mean acceptable or okay. That was decent. It can mean surprisingly good. That was decent. It can mean wearing clothes. Are you decent? It can mean within the bounds of propriety and good taste. That Steve Shives is a paragon of decent behavior, he is. It can mean not unlikely. There's a decent chance the next episode of Quantum Leap will involve time travel. And there are even more definitions than those, but here's my favorite. Courtesy of Merriam-Webster, the leading American English dictionary. That's for all you OED stands who got salty that I didn't mention it in that lexicography video I did a couple of weeks ago. Decent. Marked by moral integrity, kindness, and goodwill. In other words, not Donald Trump. Since the day he announced his candidacy for president in 2015, Trump the politician has behaved in ways that have offended a broad swath of people in this country and around the world. And I specify Trump the politician because Trump the human being has been an offensive presence for most of his life to people who were paying attention. Boorish, shallow, pompous, vain, thin-skinned, temperamental, bigoted, reactionary, ignorant, and impossibly proud of his ignorance. There are so many adjectives I could use to identify what it is about Trump that so many of us find so offensive, but I think the most fitting word for him, the one that comes the closest to comprehensively describing him, is indecent. Here again, I need to be precise regarding what sense in which I'm using the word, because there is a sense of indecent that means not in keeping with standards of propriety and good taste. And that's not the sense in which I'm using the word to describe Donald Trump, but that is the sense in which many Republicans were using it when they expressed offense and dismay at Trump's candidacy in 2015 and 2016. Remember that? Before he won, when Republicans, from his primary opponents like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio to prominent party members in the U.S. Senate like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, were all just appalled by Trump, embarrassed, outraged. Oh no, this won't do. And then he won the nomination and then won the general election, and they all fell in line. And suddenly, once he was in power, Trump wasn't so bad. That's because they perceived Trump as being indecent in the bad taste sense, not the lacking moral integrity sense. I'm sure some of them saw him in that way too. They just didn't care. They cared about the bad taste sense because before Trump took a wrecking ball to the facade of civility they'd spent the last 60 or so years hiding behind, the mainstream Republican Party put quite a bit of effort into appearing respectable. They still promoted and, when given the opportunity, enacted absolutely horrific economic and social policies that made life measurably worse for millions of people. But as they did so, they also tried their best to maintain a front of decency. When they wanted to appeal to the racists or xenophobes or homophobes in their base, of which there have always been many, they did it indirectly. Through dog whistles and insinuations, stuff they could deny if ever confronted with their true motives. But then, here comes Trump. Day one, first speech as a candidate. Fuck Mexicans, fuck immigrants and refugees, rapists and killers, I'm gonna build a wall. Not long after that, fuck Muslims, I'm gonna ban them from entering the country. And then he just kinda went on like that, insulting and threatening his opponents, mocking people with disabilities, shrugging off his long and well-documented history of racism, sexism, and, in all likelihood, repeated commission of sexual assault, endorsing political violence, but only as long as it was in his favor. And for Republicans outside his base, this was unacceptable, not because they were morally bothered by it. I don't think most of them were, even a little, but because of how tasteless and rude and vulgar it was. You can't keep up your veneer of politeness and respect and noble intentions when your main guy is up on stage bragging about how rich he supposedly is and obviously implying that one of his primary opponents has got a smaller dick than he has. In other words, Most Republicans who had a problem with what Trump was doing didn't care that it was bad. They cared that it looked bad. They were upset because Trump wasn't socially acceptable. He wasn't superficially decent. That's not the kind of decency I mean. Which is not to say decency in the sense of observing the social niceties isn't ever important. It is. But that kind of decency, you can fake that pretty easily. And lots of people do. What really matters is what's behind decency of that sort. Is it purely performative, or is it reflective of who someone really is? It's the deeper form of decency, the morality, the goodness, the compassion, the interest in the well-being of others that has been attacked by Trump, by his encouraging millions of people to embrace the ugliest aspects of our politics and some of the darkest of our impulses. That's what Trump and his supporters and his enablers are threatening to rob us of as a nation, along with, democracy. Because of that, and because the absence of that kind of decency is perhaps the defining characteristic of Donald Trump as a politician and a human being, I think it's absolutely essential that anyone who wants to defeat Trump establish themselves as his direct opposite in that regard. If Joe Biden wants to beat Donald Trump, again, because let's not forget, he already beat him in 2020, he needs to convince the American people that unlike Trump, he is a decent man. And it's at this point that I need to talk about Gaza. I like Joe Biden. He wasn't my first choice. I supported Elizabeth Warren during the primaries in 2020, but when he got the nomination, I voted for him, and I fully intend to vote for him again in November. I like him. Well, one reason why I like him is that of all the presidents in my lifetime, and hell, of all the politicians to attain national prominence in my lifetime, whether they became president or not, he seems the most like an ordinary person. He reacts to things like an ordinary person would, for better and for worse. His speech is punctuated with rhetorical crutches like, "I'm serious," and "I really mean it," which make him sound like people I grew up with. People in my family, people I know. He's experienced tragedy and loss and endured. He loves his family without condition or reservation, including his deeply troubled and troublemaking son. He's empathetic and earnest. He's far from perfect. I think he's too much of a traditionalist. I think he's too eager to reach across the aisle. It's gratifying to see him calling out the cruelty and criminality and hypocrisy and aspiring fascism of MAGA Republicans, but he hasn't got the memo that MAGA Republicans account for pretty much the entire party at this point, and that's frustrating. He, along with the rest of the country, to be fair, was a little too eager to declare victory over the COVID-19 pandemic. I wish he was more progressive on, say, police reform. But he has impressed me to a surprising degree in certain areas. I appreciated his stubborn determination to accomplish some kind of student loan forgiveness, despite tenacious opposition from Republicans, for example. In general, I have found him to be a more than acceptable president of the United States. More importantly, he seems like a decent man. And yet, what has been happening in the Gaza Strip since early October is an atrocity. It was provoked by an atrocity, this is true, but an atrocity committed in response to an atrocity is still an atrocity and still should not be excused or enabled, and the United States, under the leadership of President Biden, has been doing both. And you cannot stand before the American people and the world and make a case for yourself as a decent person while you continue to support what the state of Israel is doing to the innocent civilian population of Gaza. Because what the state of Israel is doing to those people is fundamentally indecent. Biden's continuing support of the state of Israel is well in line with precedent. The United States has historically been Israel's strongest international ally, but that doesn't excuse continuing to support Israel, continuing to provide money and arms to Israel, while the Israeli military carries out a campaign in Gaza that has reduced entire cities to rubble seriously compromised medical services, interrupted access to water and electricity, and forced millions of Palestinians to relocate on short notice, sometimes bombing along their evacuation routes as they went. Israel's current operations in Gaza were instigated by a horrific attack on Israeli civilians by Hamas on October 7. That is absolutely true. Hamas militants killed over 1,200 people and took 200 more hostage, most of whom have still not been released, some of whom may have been killed. Intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. Taking hostages is a war crime. Killing hostages is a war crime. Hamas is guilty of committing war crimes. There is no sense in denying that, and I have no desire to deny it. Fuck Hamas. They are not the good guys here. Since October 7, the Israeli Defense Forces' invasion and bombardment of the Gaza Strip has caused the deaths of more than 20,000 people. That's almost 20 times as many as were killed in Israel by Hamas on October 7. That's 1% of the total population of Gaza, gone in a couple of months. That number includes medics and journalists and children. Around 9,000 of those killed by the IDF in Gaza have been children. 9,000 out of 20,000, almost half, are children. 7 times as many as the total number of people who were murdered by Hamas on October 7 are children. Besides the direct killing and injuring of civilians, the United Nations has also warned that food is becoming so scarce in Gaza that it's approaching famine conditions. The UN also estimates that 90% of the Gazan population has been displaced. Intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. Destruction of property beyond military necessity is a war crime. Starving a civilian population is a war crime. Mass displacement of a civilian population is a war crime. The state of Israel is guilty of war crimes. They are not the good guys here either. The good guys are the ones trying to stop this. The good guys are the ones demanding an immediate ceasefire, and that does not include the United States of America. Because under the leadership of President Biden, last month the United States of America, through our appointed representative, vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Ours was the only vote against that resolution. We stand with Israel and against most of the rest of the world. And look, okay, the U.S. Deputy Ambassador to the UN defended vetoing the resolution because he said it wasn't tough enough on Hamas. It didn't demand that Hamas release its remaining hostages. It didn't demand that Hamas stop shielding itself behind Gaza's civilian population, which it does and has done for years, and that's also a war crime. Hamas sucks. Fuck Hamas. I'm fully on board with getting rid of Hamas. But if their actions over the past few months are the only way Israel can think of to get rid of Hamas, that goal, desirable as it is not nearly enough to justify what's been happening. I understand wanting to stand by Israel too, not based on the political leanings of its government for the last very long while, or the deeply problematic way in which the country was created and its boundaries were defined, which played an essential part in causing all of this. But in general, as a concept, I get it. The Jewish people had just been decimated by the most horrifying campaign of industrialized genocide in human history, and when it was over and the mass-murdering thugs who conceived and carried it out had been defeated, the Jewish people and the rest of humanity collectively swore never again. And part of carrying out that promise was granting the Jewish people a homeland, a country of their own. Anti-Semitism is still very much alive, as we have seen quite clearly in this country in recent years. Trump and his ilk are largely responsible for that too. Thanks very much. Jews are still targets of hatred and violence, and they, like all oppressed and persecuted peoples, deserve our support, our allyship. For many people, that support extends to the state of Israel. But when you declare that you will support a nation and its government unconditionally, you create the potential for serious problems, like if that government you've pledged to unconditionally support starts wantonly committing war crimes. Israel is a nation founded in the shadow of genocide, and we must never forget that. But that doesn't mean we should stand by and do nothing, or worse yet, actively help while the government of Israel carries out its own genocide. We don't have to abandon Israel. We shouldn't abandon Israel. But if the United States doesn't do something to stop the killing, we have abandoned the people of Gaza. President Biden cannot stand for decency if he does that. And the frustrating thing is, this isn't an impossible turn to make. It would break with precedent. It would be a significant departure from Biden's personal history regarding Israel, but others have done it and are still doing it. Jewish people in Israel and all over the world have taken to the media and to the streets to protest the IDF's actions in Gaza and demand a ceasefire. So have countless others from a multitude of religious, ethnic, cultural, and national backgrounds. Senator Bernie Sanders has called on President Biden to withdraw military aid to the Israeli government and to support a UN resolution demanding a ceasefire. My own representative in Congress, David Trone, a Democrat and a longtime supporter of Israel, recently endorsed a ceasefire. More than 60 members of Congress have publicly called for a ceasefire. Polling suggests that a majority of the American public and a larger majority of Democrats also supports a ceasefire. Officials in the Biden administration, including Secretary of State Blinken, have acknowledged that the number of civilian casualties in Gaza is unacceptable. Reportedly, Biden has been attempting to nudge the Israeli government in the direction of moderation behind the scenes, but plainly, he needs to do more. He needs to demand publicly an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And he should make it clear that if that doesn't happen, the steady stream of money, guns, and ammo that's been flowing from the U.S. to Israel for the past several decades is going to dry up. And the U.S. is going to add its voice and its economic and diplomatic muscle to the international efforts to stop Israel from completely wiping Gaza and its people off the map. And I know the government of Israel and its defenders respond to demands for a ceasefire by declaring that Hamas must be destroyed, those taken on October 7 must be returned, those killed on October 7 must be avenged. We can't just let Hamas get away with it. The thing is, I'm not arguing that Hamas should be allowed to get away with anything. Where exactly would they be getting away to? I'm arguing that Israel and Hamas should stop shooting at each other and killing each other's civilians. They should cease fire, and then the government of Israel, in cooperation with the international community, because we've seen how it acts when left to its own devices, should figure out a way to hold Hamas, and in particular the terrorists responsible for planning and carrying out the attacks of October 7, accountable for those attacks, without killing everyone else in the Gaza Strip at the same time. What's happening in Gaza, what's been happening for more than 3 months now, has to stop, and the United States, led by President Joe Biden, needs to take an active role in stopping it. Joe Biden should do this because what Israel is doing is wrong. He should do this to help the innocent people of Gaza. He should do it because if he doesn't, protesters are going to keep crashing his campaign events like they did in Charleston. He should do this to defeat Donald Trump in another presidential election, and most of all, he should do this because it's what a decent man would do.